Well, thank you very much indeed for that incredibly kind introduction from Mr. Schäfler. And thank you indeed to the Ludwig-Erhard Foundation for this prize, which I'm honored to accept. And once again, I must thank my many colleagues at the Financial Times who work with me on this story, and the whistleblowers without whom none of this would have been possible. It is a privilege to be here with you today, virtually, and I wish I could be there in person. I too had hoped that we would be able to meet in person. And apologies for not being able to respond as I would hope to in German. I'm afraid that is one of the embarrassing things that I do lack. But it is a privilege to be given a few minutes to say a few words. It's been a very long time since my own training in economics. So rather than claim any special expertise, I thought I might offer a few brief thoughts from a perspective of a reporter on how and why the Wirecards of the world can thrive. Because a year on from the collapse of Wirecard, the whole story still isn't known. I'm planning on revealing much of it in the book that I'm working on at the moment. I'm going to explain for the first time, I think, how and why the fraud occurred. And also, there's lots of fascinating and amazing things about Jan Marsalek, Wirecard's charismatic chief operating officer, who led this wild and improbable life as both a spy master, a finance executive, and a common thief. But if my publisher won't mind, I'd like to give you a very small preview of that today. I'd like to tell you about Jan Marsalek, because one of the strange things about the last 6 years was that I never spoke or even met Jan, even as we tried to get the better of each other. We're the same age, pretty much, and I knew his fingerprints were all over everything. The accounting fraud, the surveillance, the hacking, the attempt to frame me and my colleague Stefania Palmer for market manipulation. You can read in today's Financial Times how he and a colleague joked about having his Russian friends come up with a permanent solution to the problem. At least I hope it was a joke. Well, he may have wanted to be James Bond, but Jan Marsalek was a human being just like the rest of us. He spent his life in airplanes, crisscrossing the world in first class. And a few years ago, he was suffering from an extremely bad back. A hypochondriac anyway, he had a weakness for experimental medical treatments. He decided to give inversion therapy a go. Now, if you're not familiar with inversion therapy, it involves suspending yourself by the ankles on a board. Marsalek obviously got one of the best of these contraptions which money could buy, strapped himself in, and leaned back. What he hadn't done, however, was carefully calibrated the balance of the board. Try as he might, he couldn't get back up. He was stuck there, hanging alone, trapped, the blood rushing to his head. Now that's a dangerous place to be. Left like that too long, you can suffocate. But let's leave Marsalek dangling there for a moment and consider his predicament. Whose fault was it? Was it his own, as a free economic agent for rushing in without reading the instructions? Perhaps if he had properly researched the practice ahead of time, he wouldn't have got stuck. Perhaps he trusted the brand, or the recommendation of a friend to give it a try. Maybe he thought consumer safety standards wouldn't allow the sale of such dangerous equipment, at least without prominent warnings. Maybe just his back hurt so much that he wasn't thinking at all. The reason I mention all this is that there is a lot of blame to go around when it comes to Wirecard, and no clean answer as to how it got away with it for so long. Let's consider the professional failures which allowed Wirecard to defraud billions from banks and investors. We have the auditors, the regulators, the banks, the investors, and the prosecutors. Starting with EY, its audit work was a disaster. Wirecard's accounting was fraudulent in part since at least 2010, yet EY gave Wirecard the all clear year after year, in the face of persistent questions about the accounts raised by the Financial Times and others, as well as its own internal fraud team. Only at the very end was it forced to do the most basic requirement of an audit check, to see whether the bank balances were genuine. As was mentioned earlier, the regulators at BaFin were warned time and again by researchers, by whistleblowers, and the press that something was rotten inside Wirecard. Faced with compelling evidence of accounting fraud and market manipulation, it chose to defend its own record of investing Wirecard's critics. It wasn't a lack of power. It was BaFin had the powers available to it. It just didn't use them to investigate market abuse. It could have used these to obtain documents and other evidence, and the fraud would have been exposed far, far sooner. There's the banks. Several investment banks helped Wirecard raise 1.4 billion euros of new debt in September 2019. That very process exposed that Chief Executive Markus Braun was lying. He had claimed that the business in the Middle East, which produced all of Wirecard's profit, was audited. The bond documents revealed that actually it wasn't. It may be a small lie, but there's a phrase American short sellers use. There's never only one cockroach in the kitchen. Which brings us to the investors. Professional investors who purchased the bonds and shares of Wirecard after January 2019 have now, at least I hope, realised the value of a Financial Times subscription. Even prior to that, it is clear that large numbers of professional investors did not understand the business they were investing in. Some of them did so on the basis that Wirecard operated in highly profitable legal grey areas, which perhaps reflects a perception about the low priorities of the authorities towards money laundering. Now about those prosecutors. What was the difference between the mindset in Singapore, which quickly launched a criminal investigation, and Germany, where even after the fraud was exposed, Jan Marsalek was allowed to stroll out of the country to Belarus? One of the answers is a manifest failure of imagination. They simply could not see those successful businessmen as fraudsters. In Singapore, however, it had just gone through the 1MDB scandal of the billion-dollar whale Joe Low. Although I will admit, I still don't have a good answer to why so many people seem to think foreign journalists were easily corrupt. Another thread that runs through all of these failures is the commodity which is abused in every fraud: trust. At each step, everybody took it on trust that somebody had somewhere had done the work. Investors trusted the banks, who trusted the rating agencies, who trusted the auditors, who trusted the law firms and consultants, which Wirecard paid to say that everything was okay. It was circular. The government looked at the reputations of these professionals and thought, surely all they can't be wrong. Meanwhile, those professionals looked over at the government and thought, surely if there was something worth investigating, they would have done that by now. The thing is, that level of trust is a feature, not a bug. Our entire economic system is built around the idea that most people, most of the time, are doing the right thing. There are rules and procedures and checks, of course. But just think how wildly inefficient it would be if we had to approach every interaction as if the other side might be dishonest or not what they seem. There would be huge duplication of effort. We have to be able to trust auditors and banks and regulators to do their jobs properly, that the incentives are in place for them to do that. So what might we do to prevent future Wirecards? I often talk about the tactics which it used to avoid detection. Complexity, expensive lawyers, intimidation and bribery all feature. But there is one aspect which is so commonplace, such a part of everyday business that is easy to miss: secrecy. As an investigative reporter, I followed a lot of paper trails. And what you often encounter are familiar dead ends. These are typically, but not always, tax havens. The British Virgin Islands, Mauritius, Delaware, Dubai, the Isle of Man. I could go on. They are corporate hiding places, veils behind which economic activity and ownership is obscured. The use of such structures in modern business and finance has become commonplace. In various ways, these outposts of secrecy were used by Wirecard in its extensive money laundering operations and in its various frauds. In some respects, it was only thanks to the fact that it had businesses in places like Singapore and the Philippines, which do have proper requirements for financial disclosure, that the FT could in fact expose the fraud. And what's strange is that the Wirecard story shows how much people instinctively distrust secrecy. Back in 2016, Wirecard was attacked by short sellers. They set out to expose its ties to money laundering. The so-called Zatara report was not perfect, but it was immediately suspect in large part because it was published anonymously. The natural reaction to this unusual event was to ask, what are these people hiding? Meanwhile, the routine use of secrecy jurisdictions for money laundering that Zatara sought to expose, well, that just went unexamined.